All right. Well, I suppose we should go ahead and get started then. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for hanging out and for selecting the Research Methodologies, Collaborations, and Questions breakout session here as part of the Veterans Studies Association Conversations in Veterans Studies online event. We're happy you're here. You may notice that unlike a couple of the other breakouts, this one only has a couple of sort of formal speakers that are really going to just get us started. And when I wanted to do the breakout focused in research in veteran studies, I wanted to intentionally ensure that the breakout session had ample opportunity, time, and space to allow folks to come together, to ask questions, to find each other, to say, I'm doing work on this, oh, and I'm doing work on this, and to ask not only our two formal speakers for today questions, but to really ask anybody in the room who might be doing veterans work questions from folks in the room. When I first started in veterans studies, I'm an English rhetoric and compositionist by training. I was the only person in my PhD program even doing empirical research, let alone research on veterans, and no one on my committee was even prepared to sign off on an IRB. And so I know what it's like to be a fish out of water in a particular kind of program and even in one's home discipline and department. And so I really wanted to focus this particular breakout on giving lots of time and space for folks to ask questions and to come together and share. So thank you for joining us and welcome to all of you. As a couple of housekeeping things, I just have to remind you that all the breakout sessions are also being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, you're welcome to turn your cameras off during that time. Please keep yourselves muted until we get to the open end, and then you can certainly unmute yourselves to ask questions. You may also do that in the chat. You may also use any of the reactions to raise your hands or to signal any of us. I'll be moderating the session, and then I'm going to start first today by introducing the two speakers who are going to sort of let us dip our toe in the water when it comes to research methodologies, and I'll introduce them for you now. Dr. K. Neil Jenkins is a senior researcher at Newcastle University in the UK. He is a former Royal Marine Commando with a sociology PhD in socio-legal decision-making practices and postdoctoral work in hospital new drug management decision-making practices. Although a member of the British Armed Forces prior to going to university, he did not undertake studies of the military until after a number of postdoctoral studies in decision-making and information requirements in health and social care. Empirical studies of health work for the design and development of health information technologies. Since 2006, he has undertaken a series of major studies in relation to the military in society. He is currently a co-investigator on Turning Flying Dales Inside Out, Making Practice Visible at the UK's Ballistic Missile Early Warning and Space Monitoring Station. He has authored and co-authored numerous publications about the military and society, including the books The Value of the University Armed Service Units in 2015 and Bringing War to Book, Writing and Producing the Military Memoir in 2018. He's also co-editor of the Rutledge Companion to Military Research Methods in 2016 and currently co-editing the Rutledge International Handbook on Ethnomethodology, currently publishing. Also includes co-editing a special issue of the Journal of War and Culture Studies on reflections on the 40th anniversary of the Falklands-Malvinas conflict, and a special issue of the Journal of Critical Military Studies on enduring military being and identities in African armies, a collection of studies of African military veterans' experiences of military and post-military life. He is additionally co-editor of the Rutledge book series, Directions in Ethnomethodology and Conversation Analysis. Our second speaker for today, Dr. Marian Eade, is a professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies at Texas A&M University, where she focuses on 20th century and contemporary literatures, ethics, aesthetics, and violence. She is the author of over a dozen articles and book chapters, as well as Ethical Joyce out of Cambridge, 2002, and Terrible Beauty, The Violent Aesthetic and 20th Century Literature from the University of Virginia Press in 2019, and co-author with Michael Gibler of After Combat, True War Stories from Iraq and Afghanistan from Potomac Book, University of Nebraska in 2018. Welcome both Dr. Jenkins and Marian Eade and Dr. Eade. And Dr. Jenkins is going to head and get us started today.
Okay, I'm assuming everybody can hear me. So I'll just click and go ahead. Okay, thanks very much for having me here. I'm honored to be involved in this breakout. Special thanks to Corinne as well for inviting me, and to everybody here for who will participate in this session. I just already step aside from my slides just to say that when it comes to research methods, my experience is there's only two ways of understanding and doing research, understanding research methods. It's by doing them in practice yourself, or talking in depth with people who have done them themselves. There's handbooks, but you really need the real thing to understand, because each research method application is different in practice. Having said that, of course, I'm going to gloss over all of these things today. So the aim is to initiate some research methods discussion via introducing a brief overview of a number of studies I've been involved with, especially representations of ex-military personnel as a focus. These studies have a variety of data collection techniques, and hopefully will provide some discussion for research phenomena, data collection, analysis, and the research practice as collective work. All my studies have involved collaboration with the researchers, and most have involved the collaboration and input of study participants and various facilitators. My gratitude to all of them, because all of them make the research happen. These studies have not been specifically undertaken with veteраnology or veteran studies in mind, but within a broader or sometimes narrower social and cultural studies of military phenomena, sometimes policy driven, nearly always academically driven in terms of outputs, apart from the odd policy report, etc. They do often involve veterans as participants and relate to veterans issues, and could be reclassified as part of the veterans studies corpus, if that was an aim. So to focus on types of methodology, methods, and data collection techniques in the time, I will skim over the details of the projects as such and not discuss extensively their findings, which would be dealing with things discussed in the initial part of the session, but try and stick with methods and their applicability to veterans. And overall, I wish to raise the question again, through reference to each particular study, who are military veterans, and how without misrepresenting, do we study them and their experiences, past, present, and by implication, their potential futures. So the 7 studies I've chosen to talk about today, 7's a lot, so I will be going quickly over them, are military pilgrimages to the Falkland Islands. That's a study I'm doing at the moment. It's a very personal study in many ways. Second is negotiating identity and representation in the mediated armed forces. Thirdly, social production in the contemporary British military memoir. Fourthly, the value of the armed service units. 6, well, I can't count. Keeping enough in reserve, the employment of hybrid citizens and the Future Reserves 2020 program. And 7, but is really 6, turning Fylingdales inside out, which is very methodologically, I say sophisticated, but I mean that in a light-hearted way. So, but what you can see just from a glance down the methodologies which are underneath them, there's a lot of different methodologies involved, and that's what I want to touch on, because I didn't want to just specifically talk about one methodology which wasn't really applicable to anybody in particular, or only a very small group of people. So let's start with pilgrimage to the Falkland Islands. So this is a joint paper with John Beals, who's a PhD student at Staffordshire University, Keele University in Staffordshire. And this isn't a funded project on my part, but I'm a Falklands veteran, as it were, and so it's something I'm interested in, and it's for a special edition of a journal of which I'm, guest editor. So this is about the Falklands Malvinas War. It's the war with Britain and Argentina in '82. Britain wins. The junta falls. It's in 1983, a year after the war, that the pilgrimages begin, which is the topic, and it involves the families of those killed and injured, veterans themselves and politicians and other people who get to go on these things. Veterans associations are formed around these times and facilitate these returns. The Royal Air Force facilitates the flights down there, which is 6,000 miles away from the UK and very difficult to get to. And so veterans couldn't get there without the assistance of the RAF, except, with great expense and great difficulty. And also another veterans charities is subsidized high quality accommodation for veterans and returning and families. So the research methods for this particular project, it's quite complicated in that we've both come together with separate research practices for this. And it's interviews, memoirs, content analysis of veteran association newsletters, and autoethnography. So in-depth interviews with veterans of HMS Ardent. John's been doing that, although it is a ship which I saw attacked and hit by Argentinian airplanes when I was doing observation work. So it's quite a personal thing for me as well. So there's also memoirs about the Falklands War as a resource and as a data resource, which we'll come on to later about the key aspect of using memoirs. Also accounts of pilgrimages in the Summer 82 newsletter, which is a veterans newsletter from for the Falklands War, and it's a qualitative content analysis of accounts by veterans of their pilgrimage within that magazine, and autoethnography on my part, because I've been to the Falklands 4 times, once for the war itself. I went back anonymously on a research trip to with military geography, and I went as a single on my own as a single veteran, and I've been on an official pilgrimage. So it's using those experiences, documents, diaries, photographs, audio-visual recordings made at the time to assess a discussion with John to put in print our understanding of pilgrimage for veterans. So in terms of issues about veterans in specific, what I find interesting about is the veterans here are those who fought in the war and their families. Now, this is a classic version of the veteran as Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force combat veteran returning to the battlegrounds. Almost by definition, anybody who went to the Falklands, and many of the Navy and Air Force didn't actually land on the ground itself during the war itself, they are combat veterans, as they would be classically understood as veterans. But there are, of course, people outside of that remit, such as the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, which is a merchant navy sort of affiliation to the British Armed Forces, the Argentinian veterans. There's issues about veterans who can't travel on pilgrimages and access battle sites, which is a topic about the nature of being different types of veterans who do not wish to participate in pilgrimage activities, even though they can get funded for them for go for free almost. The nature of aging veterans and how the veterans, when this program of pilgrimages first started, are different now in age from they were at that time, and what that means, and the changing nature of the meaning of the wars for veterans over time, because it's the war's interpretation is not static. So there's a couple of issues which we'll come across again. So mediating identity and representation in the armed forces. I'm afraid I've got a picture over part of my screen, so I can't necessarily read my own script here. 3 main aims to this, which is investigate how the British soldier is represented in with the contemporary British print media, to consider these representations alongside those which British soldiers produced of themselves through their narratives around their personal photographs of their military lives, and to reconceptualize civil-military relations through nuanced understanding of culture rather than the military sociology issues of representation and formal military sociology. So the methodology here was a collection of news media stories with images. It was the images which we were interested in, but the context is through the text which goes with it when they're being read by people and presented, which involved daily searches of emerging newspapers as well as archives of previous newspapers, the use of digital and online archives, to get this, and we got 750 different stories collected and coded, which we then analysed to get a formal an account of the representation of veterans by the news media. We then contrasted that with the photo elicitation technique, where we had 16 interviewees and to discuss 10 of their own photographs, which they selected, and they talked about them. So what you have is issues of versions and so the problems methodology, which we could touch on later, if anyone interested in this, are about the versions and the nature of media news and its transience and its collectability. Also the problems of database creation for media images and over copyrights. And there's the issue of, who we represent as veterans when we do veteran studies, often self-selecting, self-defining about what they are. Those are issues which we can come into. So with this study itself, we have veterans in the news media are those typical to those news stories, by which I mean that there's a news stories about military things and which veterans are invoked almost often namelessly in a generic veteran opinion. Veterans do this, veterans do that. News, that's one type of news story with veterans. Second type of stories with with veterans would be around specific individual veterans who would be named, but the stories would be binary, good or bad, and the images around those would either be compromising photographs or graduation portrait of formal events with medals, typical, stereotypical representations of what a veteran is. Whereas, more interestingly, the veterans, when they have their own photographs of themselves and of their own experiences of being in the military, these photographs have a completely different topic. Very few are formal photographs, but they're about professionalism, them doing professional work of being a soldier. And so the veteran identity is about professionalism rather than being a veteran as such, and also the veterans through this method get to have a voice in their own choice of their visual representations about who they think they are, which is a key point. I'm just going to skip over that. This is something we can pick up and talk on if we want to. So in the next project is the production of the British military memoir. Now, the reason for this is we were using memoirs as data, yet we didn't really know what the veracity of the memoirs were. They were just there and we used them as accounts by veterans. And so we decided that we'd do a study. It was a big study we did do of, and we had to know what a military memoir was. We had to define that. Why? And we asked, why do veterans decide to write and publish them? How do they decide what to include and exclude? Who is involved in researching, writing, and publishing? How do they see their account as history, biography, war story, and what are the consequences of them publishing, their work? And there's a book on this, which we produced, a book about books, bringing water book, writing, producing military memoir. In terms of research methods, selecting the authors, there's lots of books on the military out there, as you know, and so the military personnel had to be the first author. We chose accounts post-1980. This was to limit to people who were still around to be interviewed and the types of wars which had gone on from 1980. We weren't interested in vanity or digital publishing, which is transformed since we undertook the study anyway. So that's another aspect of doing this types of research, transitions in the nature of publishing. There's issues around contacting authors, actually. It's a difficult process which affects representation. We did text analysis over 250 books, and we did semi-structured interviews with 21 memoirists. An interesting aspect of this in terms of representation of the veterans, it's representations of themselves in the main rather than veterans as a whole, but also the use of visualities within the written word in terms of the covers of the books, the selling of the book, the representation of veterans and soldiers, Navy aircrew, on covers and within the content in terms of photographs, and the analysis in terms of memoirs as practice and production, production as practice, and theories of militarism in popular culture. So the issues for veterans get a voice in this methodology mediated by the production process, and so veterans get a voice in producing books about themselves, but it's a mediated voice in that the production process of publishing has lots of interventions, and it's a lot of official censorship and self-censorship. Discussions of self-censorship were key about the representations of veterans by themselves to everybody else and the accountability they have for their representations of other veterans as well as themselves. Published UK memoirs tend to frame the combat veteran. Again, we get into this, who is this typical version of what a veteran is? It's reinforced by stereotypes, the generals, infantry personnel, special forces, and pilots, and or trauma and severe injuries. There's very few mundane memoirs about just ordinary mundane life, which is what is the case for 90% of the military most of the time. There's an issue here about, this form of representation of part of being part of the military industrial entertainment business, which is problematic, as was just discussed earlier, for about the recycling of the images of the veterans into who and what they may see themselves as being. And there's also the issue of the portrayal of veterans as damaged, injured, wounded, other, which was discussed previously in the previous talk. Now, this is the next one on the armed service units, which is, you can think of as akin to the ROTC in the USA, but it's slightly different. And basically, this was a study of people who went to officer training corps, but didn't actually join the armed forces, as well as those who were in the officer training corps of the various service units at the time, but not of those who went on to become members of the armed. Okay, so they did not sign full military contracts. So and they didn't have any penalties for not joining the armed forces. The value of this institution for training officers is not so much to train officers as the only end product, but to be producing people who stay within the civilian realm and become influencers. Okay, but they have been in the armed forces in a way, which we'll come to in the veterans thing. So this is more prosaic methodology, survey questionnaires, which we're all familiar with, although there is mediated access, which tempers the issues about the utility of survey questionnaires or representation of their content. And we used individual interviewees. The surveys, all with individual serving members of the three service units, open and closed questions, personal details, the courses they were on at university, the reasons for joining their service units, the opinions and attitudes, and a quantitative analysis of the results and the numerical representations of facts as resulting from them. What was interesting here, though, is we did interviews with former members who did not join the memory but remained civilians. And that raises the next question here, is what is the status of the officer cadets? They sign up as members of the armed forces, but on limited contracts with no active service. They do go through military training for up to 3 years as part of that, but they do not necessarily see themselves as veterans as such, but as people with insight to the military and military thinking. And the military can and not always see them as a valuable voice on their own behalf and worth the investment. They're almost a voice of the military without it being attached to a hard veteran status. But it does raise the question, what is their veteran status and when would it be invoked? So the next program is about reservists. Now, this is, I mentioned this one in terms of it being funded, partially funded by the Army itself. All the rest are funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which are academic bodies. But this one was partially funded by the MOD because they had a serious problem with recruitment to the UK Armed Forces, both regulars and reserves. And this was despite very expensive recruiting programs. Previous reorganization was part of the background to this, with the transformation of the Territorial Army into the Army Reserves. And the questions were, what were the barriers to the UK Reserve Forces participation? Issues around civil-military relations, the reserves, the workplace, family, and how these are negotiated. So one of the key things about this, I'll bring up the methods, but one of the things about the reservists in the UK is they deal with a lot of the issues while serving as reservists, which regulars are then going to encounter when they leave. So this binary between civilian and military, these reservists deal with in between, okay? And it becomes a veterans issue. So it's individual semi-structured interviews and focus groups as the methodologies for people who have got questions about that. We did a representative sample of both the type of units and the people who we were interviewing. The issues of mediated access via the military and the military trying to take control of the research project, which is typical of working with the military. It's just a knee-jerk reaction which they have to work, which is on them. I've found, it's a personal opinion, of course. And there's issues of dealing with people who are serving members of the armed forces as they get briefed about research in advance of it being undertaken, and one has to build that into the research methodologies. And we did focus groups as well, and they had similar issues around what data can be collected from them due to the accountability of those members to the group itself, and the lack of anonymity which individual interviews can be given. So serving reservists, civilian volunteers and former regulars. So the reservists are in two types. Some are transitioning out of the military and using the reserves as a financial and cultural buffer or as a new career. And former regulars are seen as veterans by non-regular reservists. Reservist veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan are seen as veterans by non-combatant experienced reservists, and serving reservists experience return to work issues and identity issues with work colleagues was one of the major findings of the research about, and this has great similarities between lessons to be learned from reservists in there as members of the workforce and the military, and what can be learned about transitioning regulars into the civil society. There's also an issue around private military security veterans who are often veterans of state service, but also now work in the private sector and what their status is as veterans. Right, we'll come on to the last study here. I'm rattling through this, hopefully. So this is, turning Fylingdales inside out. Now, RAF Fylingdales is a UK ballistic missile early warning site. It's one of the BMUs, the sister sites in Alaska and Greenland, which you're probably aware of. It's a satellite monitoring station and has a role in space warfare. It's situated in North Yorkshire National Park and dominates part of the skyline. It's a highly secure site with one of the triangular pyramid S-bar radars. It used to have three huge radomes, which became iconic on the landscape as well. It's seen as a mysterious site, and questions about whether it's a nuclear site or what it's got to do with spying, and even issues, people think it has something to do with alien communication technology. So the aim of the study was to look at public understanding of the and local community engagement activities to deal with the dominance of this site on the landscape and its prior secrecy. So the aim was to investigate RAF filing details and how what its functions are and how those functions are constituted. Okay, so this is methodology really quite interesting. Well, I find it so. So what we've got is an artist, a curator, a military geographer, and a military sociologist, all using mixed methods together. There's an archive and a small museum on site which had been dilapidated, which as part of the project we've renovated and forms part of our data sources as well. Due to the pandemic, we've actually produced a lot of this material online and archive of the material in the paper archive and in the museum itself. I must admit that work I can't take any credit for. That is done by others. There's creative arts practice utilizing the archive's documents and material objects, using drawing, sculpture, and audiovisual multimedia experimentation to tell the story of the site and the people who work there. There's interviews and ethnological observation of people and their work at the site and the station. The practice they engage in individually and as teams. And there's cultural geography fieldwork in and around the site to give us access to the military geographies, landscapes, and experiences, because of course the sites themselves and the people who work at them live and abide and commute and live their daily lives in the local environment. So it's not just the specific site itself. And a final thing on methods for this is we have, the problem of pandemic sensitive methods. This project started just as the pandemic got underway. So one of the things which has arisen here in terms of veterans issues, which I thought was interesting, was military veterans. We have the RAF regulars and reservists. They transition from one to the other, as was mentioned in the other, in relation to the other project, often to stay at the base and not be moved around to different sites around the country and around the world. But we also have civilian personnel directly employed, MOD and subcontractors of various types, many of whom have spent their whole careers on this site, on these sites, work alongside the military personnel and have been there longer and know more about the place than the military. So there's a question about how do we treat them as veterans, or who is a veteran of military in today's military rather than the conscripted military of the Second World War, for example. All types of these participants and veterans appear in the archive materials. So interviewing both is necessary if we're going to understand how the station is run. There's and I think I've covered the other points. So I'd just really say that one of the things here is that veteran is a context-sensitive term. It's often used very simplistically to define people and who and what they are, and we normally agree as to what that usage of the term veteran is and who it refers to. But I think in this and some of the other studies, that has become a bit blurred and necessarily has to be expanded, potentially even outside of military employees of the state in the simple terms. So, thoughts. Okay, things to discuss. So there's research in many areas of the military can involve veterans, but not always as a central theme or figure of research. So veteran studies itself, needs to look outside of those people just doing dedicated veteran studies to find new ways of looking at and doing veteran studies, because people are tackling in different ways, and there's other information, and people outside need to look in as well, of course. We need to escape from the terrible thing in British media around the hero zero versions of veterans in their representation, because veterans are as fully rounded members of society, and not simply others. And military sociology or sociology of the military can often treat them as these binaries otherness. The same applies to their families, of course.
Neil,
yeah.
Neil, I'm afraid we do have to move on. Otherwise, we're not going to get to Marion or get to chat. Okay,
so I'll just leave that there. So basically, all I was going to say to round that up is, there's lots of issues about who and what veterans are, and the multiple types of research methods available can allow us to tackle some of the issues which were raised in the previous discussion about the problems about who and what veterans are. Okay, thanks very much. Sorry for overrunning.
If we can do that. Thank you. All right. Perfect. Wonderful. All right, Marion, it's all yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach, and I hope it will only take about 5 minutes so that there will be time for discussion. I'm just going to describe my experience of working on the One Veterans Project, which is a book called After Combat. And it collects the stories of people who were deployed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan primarily. So I'm going to begin with the origin story of how that book got started and talk about a few of the methodological challenges that I hope will be helpful as people are defining their own projects. So as much of my research does, this came out of a teaching experience. I was working with first-generation, first-year students, and they were reading a common reading book for the entire college. And it was Lethal Warriors, When the New Band of Brothers Comes Home by David Phillips. And this tells the story of a particularly damaged battalion that then went on a crime rampage, many of them suffering from TBI and PTS. And so we invited one of the military science professors to respond to the book for the students. And I could virtually see steam coming out of my now friend Mike Gibler's ears. He really didn't like this book. And his point during his presentation to the students was that these are the stories of outliers and not the story of an ordinary deployment, which, as Neil mentioned, there are, the typical stories are there because they're typical, but they don't tend to be told. And as I was listening to Mike talk, I thought, well, if you don't like the way David Phillips told this story, why don't you tell the story? And then I thought, oh, wait, I want to help him tell that story. So that's when we got started. And our goal was to tell the story of ordinary deployment in the veterans' own words. So not to use our words to characterize their experiences. And so I think what I want to say about that is one wants clear parameters for a research question. So Neil was talking about, and the previous session, about sort of expanding what veteran means. And what we did instead was to contract it, right? To have a very specific population that we were interested in. Also, we weren't trying to write history. So we left a lot of the details out, which I'll come back to. Rather, we were trying to tell a story. And we were asking ourselves, what is the story of being deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan? Now, when I got started on this project, a fellow literature scholar said to me, everyone's writing a book about Iraq and Afghanistan, why would you? And another said, but everyone's not you. So I bring that up to say, what is it about you as a scholar that makes you the right researcher, in the way that Neil was talking about, having been in the Falklands during that conflict? What is it that makes your voice the right voice? Or as the former editor of Harvard University Press used to put it, think of your project the way we think of the Passover Seder. Why is this night different from all other nights? So we felt that the reason that drove our project was thinking about an all-volunteer military as quite different from the previous major wars which had conscript militaries, thinking about the war on terror context with its changing objectives over time, and then planning to be public facing as opposed to writing for an academic audience. Now, I have since written an article as an outgrowth of this that is for an academic audience, but what we wanted to do was to tell a more public facing story. So challenges, veterans don't always want to tell their stories. We recruited 30 vets for in-depth interviews, open-ended in-depth interviews. I'll come back to the problems there in a second. But for every vet who agreed to talk to us, there were 5 others we approached who didn't really want to tell their stories or change their minds about telling their stories. I felt strongly that what we needed to do to get the storytelling was to first make the veteran comfortable, and second, to immerse them back into their deployment. So we began with obvious questions like, why did you join? You know, the questions that anybody would ask them that they're used to answering. But then, like, describe an ordinary day during your deployment, you know, pick a date and tell us about it. And we found that those kind of immersion and comfort meant that people told better stories, more thorough stories, more intriguing stories, and ordinary stories, but still really evocative. Our principles changed slightly after our very first interview, when a veteran told a story that I felt, he was quite young, and I felt that he might not want others to know it in the future. So, for example, I thought, I don't think his children should read about his blackouts or his suicide attempt in a book. He should choose whether or not to tell them. And so anonymity became our next guiding principle, which actually made the book much stronger. It meant that we interspersed veterans' stories with each other so that none of them could be identified. And so this is the last 2 things I want to say. One is how one of the veterans who participated responded to the book once it came out. We had stayed in touch, and he asked for a copy and read it and wrote me and said, I could find myself, I think it was me, in the book, and I would tell the story differently now, which I was actually happy to hear for complicated reasons. And he said, I recognized something on every page, something that made me laugh, something that made me angry. So the veterans really had a chance to speak to each other. So here are 2 things that I want us to be able to anticipate as researchers. The first is, how do we transcribe these interviews? Being very self-conscious about how our questions, and Neil brought this up, how our questions frame their responses, and how to transfer the oral presentation to a written form in a way that is faithful to their voice, but that doesn't make them sound stupid, because there are all these oral tics that don't translate well to the page. So that's one thing, thinking about transcription very seriously and sort of methodically. And the second is to anticipate that you will have trouble with an IRB if you work with veterans. And I say that because though a lot of the problems that created the need for an IRB, things like the Milgram experiment or the Stanford Prison experiment, come out of the social sciences, IRBs tend to be populated by lab bench researchers, and they don't understand things like open-ended interviews or focus groups. And so one needs some help negotiating that, which is a good reason to have an organization like this. So brainstorming, questions, thoughts.
Okay, so I think that officially leaves our floor open. Pretty soon you're going to watch time change when you see the remaining, I don't know if you guys can see the remaining 10-minute marker, but it's about to say 5 minutes extra, because all of us in the breakouts have asked for 5 more minutes since we all got a little bit of a bumpy start heading in from the main room. So we've got 5 more minutes than what the timer will say, hopefully, if somebody's going to click the right button on one end. So I see Casey. Casey, you have your hand up. Casey, go ahead.
So I find the veteran conversation so far fairly fascinating. I don't know who in this group is a veteran themselves and who's not. And it's such an interesting perspective to, one, my dissertation is interviewing veterans and managers to get a two-sided perspective. And I have had to remove myself as a veteran because I put way too much of myself into it so far, to a point where I had to redo some of my interviews. I am happy to say for my particular IRB package, I did not have any issues with my school IRB at all. I was able to phrase it as an exempt study, so I'm super happy about that. But I absolutely agree that if you are a non-exempt study and you have to go through a full IRB, it's not going to be the easiest thing in the world. I very much have an interest in continuing my study with veterans throughout my career. And it's just such a fascinating perspective and different experiences. And I'll give you an example. My dissertation chair is not a veteran. She actually is originally from Turkey. Here I am, a veteran, and I am telling her about the culture that I used to be in. And one of the most fascinating things you wouldn't think about necessarily is one of the things that has been very consistent throughout all of my interviews, and I'm up to like 15 or 20 interviews now, is the amount of stress and anxiety of having to dress in civilian clothes. And just that simple transition of what a lot of people take for granted of what does that new culture look like and how inundated and integrated you are with a uniform and processes and procedures to go into an environment that has zero. It's interesting. You know, as a veteran, I have a 400-page manual to tell me what I should look like. And in civilian world, it's like, business casual. It's like, well, what the hell does business casual mean? I don't know. So one of my quotes is I didn't know I had to wear black belt with black shoes and brown belt with brown shoes. And it kind of goes on into more depth after that. But it is one of those things of when you're talking to veterans, when you are going through this type of research, it is so important to make them feel at ease. Like I will not do these type of interviews about my veteran experience unless I feel comfortable enough to be able to have that conversation without the judgment, without that air of expecting something, because it is very vulnerable and it's very hard to talk about sometimes. So all of that is to say, Marion, I totally understand where you're coming from and very much agree with a lot of the comments you made, especially with how you're conducting the interviews and allowing for that nice open space to allow for vulnerability, to allow for that true open conversation. So I applaud you for your approach.
If I could just comment quickly on the issue that Casey brought up, because it's a thorny one about exempt status, exempt research. To get exemption is sometimes complicated because there are two things. Is it research and are they human subjects? Well, the veterans are going to be human subjects unless you're doing a media analysis or something that's already in print, that sort of thing. But when you're doing things like focus groups or open-ended interviews, sometimes the IRB will say that's not research, that's journalism, which is super insulting to those of us who do qualitative research, but enormously helpful. So if you can swallow your pride and accept that you're being told that you don't do research, the exemption is worth having.
Makes for a good point. David, I think you had your hand up second, and then Charles and Matt.
Hi there, bear with me for a second. Can you hear me?
I can. Are you in motion?
I am in motion. But now I'm out of the danger zone, so it's fine. So I know we're short on time, so I very briefly want to just chime in from my perspective. So my area is student veterans. Although I am a veteran, I don't focus on much other than student veterans. And I think Marion made a very insightful point that probably opens up what I would have brought up as a point anyway, which is I think she was talking about motivations for writing a book. Man, everyone in the world has written a book about Afghanistan and Iraq, right? So tired of those books, and why would you do that? Well, the whole point, well, one way is, well, how would you do the book? Okay. The other thing is, how would you address the issue from a different angle? Everyone's done the traumatized soldier. Everyone's done the guy or gal who suffered. Everyone's done the person who had empathy with the local populace. Okay, that's great. But I think where, and this goes back to the opening session, which I thought with the Waller or whatever his name was, very deficit model, deficit oriented kind of perspective, which drives me bananas to no end for those who know me. But the different take is do it from the strengths perspective, right? Every veteran is sick and tired of talking about PTSD and how it helps them fail, right? What about soldiers or service members or veterans or whoever that are succeeding in spite of PTSD? Who's written that story, right? I have some people in my doctoral stable of students. I'm a dissertation chair. I have 11 students who are working on various military and veteran issues. And that is the key, not only to telling the story in a different way, it's more effective, but also back to the previous speaker's point about IRB. And I would disagree with the analysis on how easy it is to get exempt. Almost all of my students get exempt to talk about veterans. It's not that hard. Just what you're trying to do when you're talking from strengths perspectives is much easier. But that's how you get through IRB easier on these kinds of things, is not to talk about, hey, when was the last time you felt like killing yourself, right? Okay, that's going to create problems in IRB. And oh, by the way, that's not even really interesting, right? I'm interested in student veteran success, veteran success. Let's look at that. Let's tell the story of that. And my final parting shot is we need legions of phenomenologies on the experiences of veterans, both in and out of higher education. And from telling that story, people will better understand and be better able to support veterans. There you go. I'm off the soapbox.
Thank you, David. Charles, you have your hand up.
Yeah, but I'm having really bad internet connectivity problems. So go ahead and skip over me.
Feel free to throw it in the chat if you'd like, and we can always pitch it out later. Matt, would you like to move ahead then?
Yeah, thank you both for your talk. So my research mainly focuses on veteran employment and also like personal expression through clothing, which is ironic to what Casey just mentioned. But I was curious, how with researching veterans, how you all go about presenting it as something that's beneficial, because in the group meeting they were talking about trying to structure research in a way that focuses on programs rather than benefits. So how do you articulate doing research to your veteran population so it doesn't come off as, you know, I'm coming in from the institution trying to help you, but rather maybe it's something collaborative? Or I was just curious on your perspectives on that.
Is this a question essentially of like participant buy-in? Marion, Neil?
Neil?
Okay, well, I've been involved in a project on, I used to do a lot of work in health records, health decision-making practices and resource allocation of medical and health services, of which a certain population of the veterans, percentage of the veterans use and utilize. And so one of the ways we're coming in it from a different angle rather than an academic researcher studying veterans, I could come in at it as without a veteran identity as a researcher, or even veteran studies as a topic, and look at it as a practical everyday problem which people would have, of which they were just another subgroup of the population with its own specific requirements like anybody else have. therefore, you're not using the veteran label overtly, and therefore it becomes less problematic for them and less accountable for them for their veteran status as well, if that makes sense. It's almost like downplaying the.
Don't know why I didn't expect that. Don't know why.
If I could just address Matt's question too, I think you're on it, right? Like nobody wants to be helped. It makes you feel like a victim. But I think that there is a wide feeling in an all-volunteer military, which is most of the context post-Vietnam, of being misunderstood, of being a small part of the population that the rest of the population doesn't understand, in large part because of that damaged or heroic binary. And so I found that the veterans who did participated because they wanted to get the word out. They wanted to communicate their experience to a broader public in a way that they felt they could do in a more nuanced fashion than what they perceived the news media doing. So I felt like that was my objective, but it was also very helpful for them to think, we need to communicate to a world that doesn't understand us.
If I may cut in as well, I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but I have a topic, I have a thought on this.
There are no rules, Casey, go for it.
Okay, wonderful. Framing that in a little bit different view of what Marion was saying, quite honestly, what you will find with many, many veterans is there's still a desire for that to serve a higher purpose, so to speak. And if you're framing your research into, this is how I'm going to help others, most veterans get a little bit more of that understanding and buy-in relatively quickly. Now, you still have to frame it in a way that it's going to matter to them and that they're going to have that feeling that they are going to contribute to something greater. You take my population that I've been talking to now of, within the corporate world, why are you staying at this company? Here you are leaving the military. Why are you staying at a company as part of the questions that I'm asking? And most of it is because they truly believe in the purpose, mission, and vision of the company and making sure that they are being able to continue to serve after they take the uniform off. So you can frame it in that way as well, of just understanding, what is your overall desire and purpose to do with the research? How is it going to help others? How can you get that, that implicit want and desire to continue to serve?
Such a good point.
Can I just make a cross-cultural observation on this? Is that although Britain and the USA are very similar in many ways, and we often share the same wars, we tend to invite each other to our wars, and we tend to turn up to them. But there's, in many ways, we're very different. And one of the ways we're different is in terms of the veteran culture. There isn't a veteran culture in the UK on the scale that it is in the USA. There's been an emergent one since around 2006, but previously to that, veterans were seen as an aged group within society, usually linked to the Second World War. Of course, they've died off. Now, there was veterans associations and veterans groups.
Don't tell my dad that.
But smaller scale. And so one of the issues around, it seems to me, is that using the label veteran and being a veteran, behaving like a veteran, doing things which are expected of veterans is actually has cultural value in the US in a way which may explain how it is actually formed, what the values of it are the modes in which it is utilized by the members themselves to achieve access to scarce resources. And to an earlier point about where's all the success stories about the veterans? Well, the people who don't need access to scarce resources don't necessarily have to play at being a veteran. They'll still be a veteran, they'll know they're a veteran, and at times they will do things veteran associated, but they do it less often because they don't need to do it to gain things particularly. So the roles in which veterans are playing depend upon their social circumstances, which they return to and which they bring with them in the USA. And you can't play the same games in the UK. So doing cross-cultural study, you can see different things going on about how veteran behavior occurs in the different countries and how it's orientated in the social structures built around that as well, I should imagine.
I absolutely agree with you.
Catherine had a question.
Catherine, please go ahead.
Oh, honestly, I've lost track listening to where we've headed. I just wanted to, it's been so helpful to me to hear both professors offer the example of the complexity of a single project, right? That to get at the answer to the question you're asking, it's okay to use a variety of methods and a variety of kinds of writing to make that happen. So I just wanted to thank you both.
Thanks, Catherine. You had your hand up for a long time. I wanted to make sure we didn't miss hearing from you.
I appreciate that. It was long ago and I didn't mean to interrupt now, so I appreciate it.
No, it's a good point. And I'll just add to that and say that when we're using methods, and I've used lots of methods and done lots of research, I am a full-time researcher and have been for a number of years, is that although I know a lot about methods, those methods get tempered to the research as it emerges as a practice itself. It isn't something which you can predefine in advance and know what's going to happen. Your methods and how you adapt your methods to the research, like everything else in life, how you do that emerges as the project, as the activity goes along. And so sometimes you can read a textbook and think it'll go like A, B, C, D, and now it won't. But don't be surprised when it doesn't, and don't worry about it when it doesn't. Just try and utilize the flexibility of the research methods to do what they can do, and in the situation in which you're in, and you nearly always come out with some interesting findings.
That is so helpful.
Thank you.
Well, you should be seeing, I'm going to throw a Google Doc in the chat, perhaps. Maybe if everybody will be able to see it. We'll see. Let's see if we've unlocked it. I'm going to try and do this very quickly while you all just talk amongst yourselves. Here, let me pitch out one of my pre-moderation questions while I'm doing this. Oh, this is a good one. Here's my favorite. What challenges, considerations, or concerns must we remain aware of when pursuing lines of inquiry involving veterans and military affiliated populations?
I mean, in my opinion, since there's no rules here, to me, it all comes down to understanding the population you're truly trying to research. And, you know, there is some significant differences and significant similarities within the US military between branches and officer and enlisted, and then your junior enlisted, your junior officer, your executive officer, your executive enlisted, and how many years and what the experience is. So anytime you're talking to veterans, you want to be able to understand just at least a little bit about the hierarchy structure, and to be able to very clearly define what population you're really trying to talk to, what you're trying to do, and then again, bring that back to the how is this going to help other people?
I'd add something to that as well, which is, it sounds contradictory, but it's, you know, I think it's complementary, is that you've also got to question the assumptions that you bring as a researcher to what other people and veterans might be orientating to as veterans. There's so much, you know, I read